Hi, I'm Jim Ziebeck, military historian, and I'd like to welcome you to the Southwest Florida Military Museum's mobile bus. In the bus we have a number of artifacts that have to do with the American wars throughout our history. And the earliest part has to do with our Native Americans that were in Southwest Florida, the Seminoles, and also the Calusa Indians, who were actually called the Shell Indians and worked off of the coast with shells. The Seminoles moved down from the southwest, the Georgia area, after the Calusas were wiped out by the Spanish. So that would be our earliest history. As far as our display cases go, the earliest war that we represent here in the Mobile Museum would be the Civil War. And I'm standing next to Mary Walker, who was a Civil War nurse, and she happened to be the only recipient of America's highest military award, the Medal of Honor. She received that as a Civil War nurse and was very proud of it. She actually wore it wherever she went after the Civil War was over. Inside the cases we have some general artifacts. These are actually represent the bands that followed the soldiers and the units, the divisions around the Civil War. The various Civil War units were all represented by a band. So this was to lift the morale of the soldiers before they went into battle, and just was very patriotic. Each of the units had their own band, and our original artifacts include a fife that was given, that was actually from a Vermont regiment, and also drumsticks from a Massachusetts regiment. We also have a strand of cotton that you see. Cotton was the backbone of the Confederacy and had a lot to do with the war, the background of the war, because that was the economy that really drove the South, and they needed slaves to work the cotton fields and the farms in the South to generate their greatest product, which was cotton. And that actually went internationally too. So that involved the Europeans, the French, and the British. So when the war started, the Union made sure that they blockaded the Confederate ports in order to kind of put a stranglehold on their imports and exports from European comrades. We actually have a canteen in this case that was also found after the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. There were gigantic battles fought in Virginia, and this was one of them. And to have an artifact from a battle is kind of unique, and we're happy to have that in our collection. The bottom shelf includes some lead bullets and also some bullet molds and an early photograph which was called a carte de visite. And the soldiers were actually introduced to photography because the photographers actually followed the units around, and they would take their pictures of the individual soldiers if they wanted them taken for a fee. So it was a business in itself during the Civil War. We also have some artifacts that were found from the Southern Railroad. We have a sledgehammer and also a piece of small gauge rail from a railroad in the South. So those things are also represented here. The uniform parts, the kepi and also the jacket, are replicas. They are from a reenactor. We have a sculpture in our collection. It's called The Last Meeting by a sculptor named Ron Tunison, who did a lot of Civil War work. And this shows two famous Confederate generals, Robert E. Lee, who Lee County is named for, and also Stonewall Jackson. And this meeting took place during the Battle of Chancellorsville in Virginia. This was a crucial battle, a huge battle, and it marked one of the last great victories for the Confederacy in defending Richmond. Um, Stonewall Jackson became very famous for this because he did a flanking move on the Union troops and caught them by surprise and just rolled up the flank and defeated the Union Army. So it was a bold move by Robert E. Lee to split the army and have Jackson go around the flank and surprise the Union troops. So this is called the last meeting because it was Jackson's last battle. He was wounded while reconnoitering the troops in the field during sunset of that battle, and he was supposedly shot by his own troops, so it would be friendly fire that shot him. He was wounded several times and badly wounded in the arm, for which they had to amputate the arm. So he then developed pneumonia over a period of less than a week, and after that amputation, and he died from that battle wound. So Lee actually lost a great general, his right-hand man, during the Battle of Chancellorsville. That's why this sculpture is so famous, and it's called The Last Meeting. This is our display case for World War I, which was called The War to End All Wars. It was fought between 1914 1918 and fought in Europe. A lot of the warfare in that war was fought in the trenches, and therefore we have a number of artifacts that have to do with trench warfare in our main museum, but we brought a few pieces to go with our mobile museum here on the bus. This is also known as the first modern war because it involved machine guns, aerial combat, the fighting between planes, and also tanks were used also in World War I, and trucks. So this was the first real mobile war, and therefore called the first modern war. I'm standing next to a mannequin. It's a World War I nurse, and she has also a Red Cross dog, a rescue dog, with her. But this is an original coat that a World War I nurse would have worn during the war, and you can see the original color gray here, but over a century of sunlight it's faded out. So that is an original coat from World War I, a nurse's coat. We also have an original frock coat also, and also a campaign hat here. So those are original uniform pieces from from World War I. Next to that, we have a canvas bucket that was used by troops to carry water, and a World War I helmet. And the trench periscope is next to that. Now the trench periscope, like I said, a lot of the war was fought in the trenches, so to protect themselves from being shot, they had these periscopes that could peer up over the lines and search out what the enemy was doing. So that's a periscope that they will hold above the trench line in order to protect themselves from being shot. On the top shelf, we have a pack that carried a gas mask. There were a lot of gas bombs fired by artillery shells, and there were a lot of deaths caused by the gas, the poison gas. So each of the sides had their own gas masks. Next to that, we have an actual first aid kit from the Aeronautics Corps, and like I said, this was the first modern war where planes were used. So to have an artifact from the early aviation of warfare is pretty rare, and we're happy to have that in our collection. We also have next to that pouch a tin that carried foot powder. Because there was so much trench warfare, the guys actually lived in the trenches for weeks and sometimes months, and had to have protection. So there was a lot of sanitary issues involved in that also, and foot powder would be one of the things that they would find valuable. This is our case that has to do with World War II. The fact that America fought in World War II, they weren't really involved in the early part of the European theater, but they became involved after Germany declared war on us, just like a week after Pearl Harbor was bombed. So when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, that actually started the war in the Pacific, and then less than a week later, Adolf Hitler foolishly declared war on America, and that brought us into the European war also. So America at that time, within a week, was fighting on two war fronts. The war in the Pacific against Japan, and the war in Europe against Germany and the Axis powers, Italy also. In our case, we have a number of artifacts that have to do with the war, and actually war in Southwest Florida also, how that impacted us. On the very left side of this display case, we have a bust of Thomas Edison, and Thomas Edison actually had a lot to do with the technology that came about in World War I and II. He was one of the guys that experimented with sonar devices and underwater detection. So our submarine efforts, and also detecting enemy submarine warfare through underwater detection sonar, was Thomas Edison had a lot to do with that. So we also have next to him a display that has to do with our history here in Southwest Florida, and especially the Fort Myers area had one of the largest training bases for gunners of bomber crews especially. So the gunnery school was located east of Fort Myers, about 7 miles east, in the area of Buckingham and Lehigh Acres. So this was a massive base, and at one time it could house 16,000 men at one time. During the course of the 3 years that it was going, from 1942 to 45, they trained about 50,000 men for gunnery at the gunnery school. This was a 5-week course, so their early training had to do with familiarizing themselves with their weapons, and that included the 50 caliber machine gun and also the 30 caliber small machine gun. But after that, their classroom work, they went into the field and started their training with target practicing. And in the 5th and final week of training, they were taken out into the Gulf of Mexico by plane, and they actually fought mock battles in the air with their gunners. So this was really first-hand experience as far as aerial combat goes, and it was really advanced training. Of the 5 training schools in America for aerial gunnery, Fort Myers would have been the most advanced and also the largest. Next to that, we have 2 busts that have to do with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and also Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And they became great friends during the course of the war, and of course they were the backbone, America and Great Britain, of the Allied effort to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. The British especially were very instrumental in holding back the Nazis early in the war, starting in 1940, and when America was supplying them at the time, but America became involved in a year later after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the declaration by Hitler of war on America. So that's when we had actually got our troops involved there in Europe. Next to this, we have a child's gas mask, a German child's gas mask actually. During the course of the war, we didn't have any evidence of gas being used on the battlefield, but of course the Germans used it in their concentration death camps throughout Europe, extermination camps. So they did use gas in those cases to kill people. The next part we have is to honor those who were in the medic service. So we do have a medic kit with some various bottles that are still filled with solutions from the war. So that's like 75 years old now, and it still contains medicine in those bottles. On the bottom shelf, then sweeping, we also have Red Cross helmet and also a small mock-up of a medic camp. And also we have some forceps that were used for medical reasons. In back of that we have some German daggers and also a German bayonet. Next to that, on the mannequin head, we have an aviation cap or helmet, a soft one, and that was used by Aviators, American Aviators. So we do recognize them also. And next to that, we have a navigation compass that was used for the planes and aerial combat situations. And next to that, we have a few Japanese items. We have a naval hat, a soft cap, and also a piece of surveying equipment from the Japanese Army. And also the shell on the bottom is earmarked from the attack on Pearl Harbor. So we do have an actual artifact from the Pearl Harbor attack. The one group on the top shelf next to the Buckingham, the patch, has to do with the women who served as pilots during the World War II period, and they were called WAS, Women Air Supply Pilots. And their patch was a really nifty patch, and that was actually designed by the Walt Disney Company for them. They were volunteers and they were excellent flyers. They were used to ferry the planes around to the different bases in America, and also some of them flew planes to Europe also. So they had some hazardous duty too, because at Buckingham Army Airfield in Fort Myers, they were towing the targets for the guys to fire their guns at targets. So they were flying target planes that towed those targets. So there were a number of women that were killed in those training exercises, and also flying their planes around the different bases. There were accidents, so they did suffer casualties during the war, and they were volunteers. Only one of 25 applicants got in, so they were the cream of the crop as far as women aviators go. The home front was pretty interesting in World War II because everyone was involved in helping in the war effort. We had the women working in the factories, and also volunteer nurses, and also volunteer pilots. So the women did a number of jobs in World War II. And like I said, the women who worked in the factories were called Rosie the Riveters. They were known as Rosie the Riveters. So even the children became involved. And in our collection here, we have a small child wearing a Campfire Girls uniform. And this is an actual uniform from a group in Wisconsin. And the patch she's wearing is a World War II patch. It has CFG, which is Campfire Girls, and also a V, which means victory. So whenever you see the victory patch, that means World War II, V for victory. Now, the Scouts were very involved in collecting different things for the war effort, like iron, aluminum, paper, rubber, collecting, and these things were then recycled and made into war implements. The Campfire Girls themselves raised enough money in their collecting to afford one hospital plane. So the girls each of the scouting groups had campaigns where they would raise enough money, and then they would donate it, and then it could be used for the war effort. But this girl was from Oshkosh, Wisconsin, and we were happy to have her little scout uniform as part of our collection. This is Korean War. This is also known as the Forgotten War, but over 40,000 Americans died in this war, fought between 1950 and 53. This was a war to stop communists from infiltrating into South Korea. So it was a fight against communism. And for the soldiers who were there, they especially remember how cold it was. And that was evident in a number of key battles, including the battle at Chosin Reservoir. And it was so cold, we actually have a painting of that in our collection here. But actually it was so cold that it froze the liquids in the vehicles, and the vehicles couldn't actually operate because of the cold weather, below zero temperatures. The one thing that hurt the American troops too was that they had leftover uniforms, and they weren't well equipped. They were using leftover equipment from World War II, and that went for the cold weather gear too. And a lot of men suffered because of the cold weather, and they weren't equipped with warm weather or cold weather gear that they needed to survive that cold. In our artifacts section, we have a mess kit, also a canteen, and a medic kit, a compass, a knife, and also we have a box that has envelopes in it and stationery. And this was especially important for mail calls, they were called. So throughout the different wars, one of the pastimes of the soldiers when they weren't fighting, they had a lot of free time, and a lot of mail was written back and forth between the home front and also the soldiers and loved ones in the field. So that's why we have this represented, because mail call was such an important part of the soldier's life, receiving something from the home front. We have a gas mask also for gas warfare represented there, and a trenching tool. We have a naval aviator's helmet, and also a regular GI's helmet. And then we have two types of field telephones that were used, of course, in the field. So that's our selection of Korean War artifacts.
You're up.
This is our display for the Vietnam War. This is a war that was fought in Southeast Asia, and it was also a war to stop communism from infiltrating South Vietnam. So we were fighting against a country, an army that knew their territory, and therefore it was a very hard-fought war because of the jungle warfare and the terrain. Inside our display case, we have actually a uniform of a Viet Cong person, and also a bamboo hat. But in back of the uniform shirt are sandals that were worn. They're black sandals, and we have one of the sandals turned up to show you the bottom part of the sandal, which is actually a tire tread. So the Vietnamese people were very innovative, and they used everything to their advantage, and that included using tire tread rubber for their sandals. They were also very creative as far as their booby traps go, so Americans had to be very alert to booby traps One of the things they had were those long sticks that were called punji sticks, and they were very deadly because sometimes they were had poisons on their tips, so they would easily really wound or even kill soldiers in the field, especially those who were walking along and then fell into these pits that were bordered by these punji sticks sticking out. In front of that, we have these tiny little arrows called flechettes, and these flechettes were actually put inside of the artillery shells, and when the artillery shells were fired, they would spread out just like a shotgun shell would spread out, and these tiny arrows would be spinning, and they could do a lot of harm to the body by that spinning and getting into the body. So those were very deadly, used by the Americans. Next to that, we have a set of our survival cards. One of them was a snake card, and there was a number of hazards that the soldiers had to watch for, and one would have been the poisonous snakes that could strike them and be fatal. We have a Viet Cong soldier's ammo belt here, so they were very crudely made, their equipment, but it was very functional, and that's one of the things we have from the enemy represented here in this display case. The back portion is an intrusion detector, it's called, and the U.S. military used that to put around the fire bases especially. They would put these sensors into the ground, and they could detect movements up to 100 yards. They could listen and hear footsteps or whatever from these sensors, and then they could know that the enemy was approaching or that he was in the vicinity, and they could fire their weapons like mortars outside of the fence line, and also their small arms fire too, to stop the enemy from coming into that fire base. Go. This last display case has to do with the Gulf Wars, or the wars in the Persian Gulf. There were a number of operations that had to do with this war that started in 1990 when Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. We first had Operation Desert Shield, that went into Desert Storm, and finally Desert Saber. So the Gulf Wars are still active, and we are still involved in some of the actions in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf, and they are to protect our vital interests too. So a number of artifacts that we have. The most unique probably in this case would be the story of Silly String. This was a child's toy actually that was used at parties. It was kind of a goofy thing, just a party favor to spray around, and it would give the effect of just a gooey kind of mess that had to be cleaned up. But anyway, the soldiers in the field in the Persian Gulf found that they somehow found that Silly String could be used to detect tripwires. So when they were going through buildings in the darkness, they would spray this goofy string or silly string in the darkened room, and it would settle on a tripwire, and they could see that in the darkness the silly string would settle because it was lighter than the tripwire and wouldn't fire it. So this saved a lot of lives because guys were getting blown up by IEDs and also these booby-trapped homes. So the silly string was something they could use, and therefore a number of these cans of silly string were shipped to the soldiers, and they would use that to spray in the room before entering. Some of the artifacts too from this section. This is a modern war, so we have the the best of technology as far as night vision and also helmets and also gear that has to do with communication. And that's all included in this helmet we have, this fighting helmet that an aviator, a helicopter pilot would use. So this is one of the modern helmets that we have on display here. Next to that is our picture of our commanding general during Desert Storm, Operation Desert Storm, and that's General Schwarzkopf, who died in Tampa, Florida, actually, and is buried in Florida. Some of the pictures, too, have to do with the operation in the desert as far as attacking Saddam Hussein in his desert army. So that operation was called Operation Shock and Awe. That's what they called it anyway, because it was such a lightning type war where we just decimated the Iraqi troops in their bunkers and also in the wide open roads leading into Iraq. This last section is a visual section. It has to do with one of the worst attacks on American soil, and that was the Day of Infamy, the terrorist attack on 9/11 in 2001. And the top photo shows the collapse of the Twin Towers, one of the Twin Towers in Manhattan, after it was hit by planes. Terrorists hijacked two planes and hit both towers, one after the other, and caused them to collapse. So this is known as our Day of Infamy as far as the attacks by the terrorists go. Over 3,000 people died in just that day on the attacks on the Twin Towers, the attacks on the Pentagon, and also the plane that was an aborted attack. It was flying back to Washington when passengers on Flight 93 took over the plane and captured it, but it went into a dive mode and actually crashed outside of Pittsburgh in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So those were the 4 planes that were used that day. They were hijacked and used as guided missiles, basically. We have some other graphic photos that have to do with the attacks in Manhattan and the Twin Towers. This is known as Ground Zero. And the top photo shows a number of firemen that were just heroic. The first responders suffered a number of casualties that day, and especially the firefighters who had gone into the Twin Towers to try and rescue people when the buildings collapsed, and they were also killed. They were also victims. So the top photo shows the firemen at the scene in Ground Zero, and also the bottom photo shows the remnant after the dust was starting to settle on the debris field at Ground Zero in the Twin Towers area. The last display area we have is a flag that was flown at the Ground Zero site in New York City by the Edison Company, and that flew for about a month in their trailer over the Ground Zero site. So as they were working, that flag was flying in that area. The other is a sculpture of the firemen raising the flag. It's an iconic photo taken from a photo and made into a sculpture, and it shows the only standing remains of the tower erect, and also the firemen raising the American flag. I'd like to thank you for joining us in our mobile museum. The Southwest Florida Military Museum has several locations. One is at the Edison Mall, and also we have a room also in the shell factory. So there are many more artifacts to be seen in those locations. But just keep in mind that our basic goal is to honor, preserve, and educate our kids on what was America's past and also the hope for the future in our armed services. So thank you for joining us.